Hello, dear students. Today we'll discuss about the types of scales. I am Dr. P. Rosina George, Assistant Professor in Geology, St. Joseph College for Women. So we are going to discuss about what are scales, their development and location, functions of these scales, what are the different types of scales, some questions based on it, and the references. The learning outcomes are: you will be able to describe the development and location of scales in fishes. And you will be able to identify different types of scales in fishes. And you will learn the different functions of scales in fishes. So let's discuss about what is a scale. A scale is a small rigid plate that grows out of an animal's skin to provide protection. It is generally classified as part of an organism's integumentary system. And the study of scales is called squamatology. Let's discuss about their development and location. These are produced in the mesoderm. They are located between the epidermis and the underlying tissues. Genes which are responsible for the development of scales in fish are same that result in hair and tooth development in mammals. They usually grow on a fish in overlapping plates with the free end of the scale pointed towards the tail. Let's discuss the functions of scales. Scales provide external protection to its body as they are tough and slippery. They help to protect a fish from scrapes, parasites, and other external injuries. Because they are all attached at only one point, they provide flexibility so that the scales can slide over each other as the fish body bends while swimming. Let's discuss the different types of scales. There are 4 different types of scales: cosmoid scales, ganoid scales, placoid scales, and elasmoid scales. Elasmoid scales are of 2 types: cycloid scales and ctenoid scales. Cosmoid scales, these are the scales of bony fishes which evolved a long time ago. In their ancient form, they had 4 layers, one of dense bone, one of spongy bone, one of dentine, and one of enamel. Such scales are called cosmoid scales, and they only exist in the modern world on the coelacanth species or as fossils. Ganoid scales are derived from cosmoid scales and are the evolutionary oldest type. They are found on species like bichirs, garfish, sturgeons, and reedfish, and they are hard solid scales. Placoid scales, they evolved separately in the cartilaginous fish and in the bony fish. The scales of sharks and rays are made of bone and resemble teeth in that they have soft central area called the pulp, a middle layer of dentine, and a hard outer layer of enamel. These scales are called denticles and are described as placoid scales, as they protrude through the epidermis and are not wholly covered by it. Elasmoid scales. They are the most common form of fish scale, and it is a thin plate that you find on most of the fishes. It is often described as seen in 2 forms. One is ctenoid or ctenoid scales, which have a set of fine teeth along the posterior edge. And another one is called as cycloid scales, which are simply rounded on the outer posterior. Let's see what are these cycloid and ctenoid scales. Cycloid and ctenoid scales have different shapes, but the same composition and positioning is seen. The vast majority of bony fishes have cycloid or round scales. These have a smooth outer edge and are most common on fish with soft fin rays such as salmon and the scales of a fish may be all of one kind. Like perch have ctenoid scales while herrings, minnows and trout all have cycloid scales. Or both type of scales may be found on the same fish. Sea perches. They have mostly ctenoid scales above the lateral line and cycloid scales below the lateral line, while dab species have ctenoid scales on the upper colored surface and cycloid scales on the lower white surface. Not all fish have scales. Some species, such as the sunfish and the Siluroidae, have none at all. Other species, like the common eel, appear to have no scales at all, but they really have microscopic scales deeply embedded in their dermis. Even in those fish that have scales, they do not always cover the whole body. Thus, fish that swim quickly or that live in fast-flowing waters like trouts and tunas, etc., they tend to have small scales, while fish that swim slowly in moving waters tend to have larger scales like carps. In some South American catfishes, the scales have become modified into bony plates to make armor. This is also the case in seahorses and pipefish. In these cases, the added protection is paid for by reduced flexibility and speed. The scales of some fish decrease in size from the head towards the tail, like in carps and herrings, reflecting the need for greater flexibility towards the tail of the fish. What is fish scale evolution? This is a diagrammatic representation of the relationship between the annual growth of a fish body and its scale. The scales of modern fish are embedded in the dermis and are covered entirely by the epidermis. They grow as the fish grow. Thus, in many cases, they reflect a history of the fish life. Experts in scale patterns can not only tell you how old a fish is from its scales, but also how many times it has spawned and if it has been seriously ill. Take a pause and answer these questions. Placoid scales are present in salmon, lamprey, sharks, or common carp. Fish have slippery scales on their bodies. This is most helpful in their locomotion, nutrition, respiration, or excretion. Answers are placoid scales are present in sharks, while fish have slippery scales on their bodies, which is most helpful in their locomotion. In summary, a fish scale is a small rigid plate that grows out of the skin of a fish. The skin of most jawed fishes is covered with these protective scales, which can also provide effective camouflage through the use of reflection and coloration, as well as possible hydrodynamic advantages. Fish scales are part of the fish integumentary system and are produced from the mesoderm layer of the dermis, which distinguishes them from reptile scales. These are some of the references for this topic. Thank you.